Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with a Historical Mysteries episode focusing on the enigmas of the ancient world. Before we begin, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, the notification bell, and to drop a comment saying what you're doing or where you're watching from. According to legend, there was a single morning when the collected knowledge of humanity was suddenly rendered into ash with the burning of a library. I'm not talking about some obscure regional archive, but a universal repository aiming to hold all the written knowledge of the ancient Western world. If you're at all familiar with the ancient world, you've likely already guessed that I'm talking about the Great Library of Alexandria. But this isn't the story of the myths surrounding the burning of the library, but rather a look into the nature of the knowledge that was held and produced while it stood. To understand the scope of the library, you have to appreciate the scale of the city that housed it. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, was engineered to be a massive cosmopolitan hub linking Greece and Egypt. Featuring wide boulevards laid out in a grid and grand structures of granite and marble, the city was intended as a global showplace. When Alexander's general Ptolemy I established the new dynasty, his ambition was unprecedented. He aimed to make Alexandria the undeniable economic and intellectual capital of the entire known world. While it's unclear when the Great Library was first established, it's generally believed that it first came together under Ptolemy's immediate successor. The Great Library wasn't just a storage facility as the name would suggest to our modern eyes. It was an integral part of the larger Museion, a research institution dedicated to the Muses. Also, just as a quick aside, I had never put two and two together that our modern word museum was derived from the Muses. But now looking at the word, I find it hard to believe that I never made this connection at any point in my life. But I digress. The Museion served as a state-funded university or think tank where scholars received royal stipends, lived together, and collaborated intensely. This centralized, lavishly funded royal patronage transformed Alexandria into the capital of knowledge and learning, distinguishing it from rivals like the Library of Pergamum. The Ptolemies intended the Museion and its library to bring together the very best scholars of the Hellenistic world and, crucially, to produce new scholarship. This state sponsorship yielded revolutionary works. Under the Ptolemies, hundreds of key figures worked within this structure over the centuries. Zenodotus of Ephesus, for instance, undertook the essential work of standardizing the texts of Homer, establishing definitive versions of the great epics. Callimachus, a poet, created the Pinakies, a comprehensive book catalog often credited as the world's first systematic library index. There was also Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a brilliant polymath and chief librarian who wasn't content just to read about the world. He successfully calculated the circumference of the Earth to a remarkable degree of accuracy using mathematical and geographical principles developed at the Museion. The great inventor and engineer Hero of Alexandria, who invented the world's first steam engine, was also associated with the Great Library. That's one thing we modern people often forget. This library wasn't solely about preserving the past. It was about building the future using the library's massive resource base. These scholars weren't just preserving the past, they were aggressively building the future, driven by the library's massive resource base. The Ptolemies pursued a policy of universal acquisition, unprecedented in its scope and scale. Their goal, at least aspirationally, was to acquire a copy of every written work ever produced in the entire known world. The Ptolemies' policies for procuring texts were famously aggressive and well-funded. One controversial practice was the seizing of any written documents found on ships entering Alexandria's harbor to have them copied. In an act that can only be called state-sponsored theft, they kept the originals and returned the copies to the owners. Given the amount of time it took to produce a single copied text at the time, this effectively meant that many of these copies were simply never claimed and also entered into the library. We can't know precisely how many scrolls were held in the collection. Ancient sources offer conflicting and often hyperbolic figures, reflecting the mythological status of the library. Estimates for the total collection size at its height vary wildly, from a conservative 40,000 scrolls up to 400,000. Some ancient sources even report figures as high as 1 million scrolls and books, though this is generally believed to be a literary device rather than an actual estimate. In essence, saying that there were 1 million books there was basically just saying there's a near infinite amount of content in the library. Modern historians often look skeptically at numbers in the 6 figures, calculating that such numbers would only be possible if the library contained numerous identical copies. However, others have proposed that numbers in the 6 figures could be accurate, but that we could simply be unaware of approximately 90% of ancient Greek writers. Personally, I like this theory, as we know of a lot of ancient writers, simply because other authors cited their works in surviving ancient texts. I think it's safe to assume that most ancient works didn't make a splash and were never widely cited, or perhaps never cited at all. Also, it's important to remember that many of these works were short scrolls rather than full-on books. When ancient writers made their estimations, they included all documents held in the library, not just full-blown books. If my intuition on this is correct, I see no reason why the library couldn't have had over 100,000 works, especially given the Ptolemaic patronage of the project. The intellectual breadth was truly cosmopolitan, and there were some non-Greek works included as well. However, it's important to remember that the entire known world at that time was, in essence, Hellenized, at the elite level that produced scholars. A scholar from Egypt would be writing in Greek, just as a scholar from Persia would be as well. Hellenic culture reigned supreme. However, it became a critical cross-cultural center, facilitating immense translation projects. The most famous example is the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Pentateuch into Greek. This monumental translation was undertaken in Alexandria out of practical necessity for the large Hellenized Jewish community. Many having only a limited understanding of the biblical language, they wanted to be able to read key religious texts in a language they could fully understand. This was made possible specifically because of the abundance of research material available at the library, as well as the scholars that resided there. The library wasn't just collecting, it was actively integrating and translating world knowledge, confirming its unique status as an incubator of global scholarship. To truly grasp the magnitude of the eventual loss, it's important to consider the staggering economics of ancient knowledge production and reproduction. Most items were made of papyrus, which could only be produced from a reed that grew in the Nile. Papyrus was fragile, cumbersome, and expensive. Beyond the cost of the material lay the price of skilled labor. Copying texts was a pre-industrial, non-mechanized process that demanded expert scribes. Transcribing a major philosophical or historical work wasn't a matter of hours, but often required weeks or even months of dedicated, specialized labor for a single copy. Therefore, when a scroll was destroyed, it represented an immense, irreplaceable expenditure of both controlled raw materials and highly trained human capital. A library of even 40,000 scrolls, the lowest estimate of all, represented millions of man-hours in transcription time alone, let alone the hours that went into producing the research. The centralization of this accumulated wealth, while crucial for scholarship, proved to be its greatest vulnerability. Because widespread mass distribution was impossible, a single master copy held in Alexandria often represented the most authoritative or even the sole surviving record of a work. If a text lacked copies elsewhere, its destruction meant total intellectual annihilation. Notably, the fall of the Library of Alexandria in a single day due to a fire is more legend than history, though like many myths, there's a significant kernel of truth. In reality, the library was dealt numerous blows, starting with Julius Caesar inadvertently burning some of the warehouses on the library's grounds in a siege in 48 BC. When the Romans fully took over Egypt a couple decades later, the royal patronage of the Ptolemies naturally came to an end. Without meaningful funding, the library and the Museion began their slow slide into obscurity, having never really recovered from the Julius Caesar blaze. The main library and the Museion were eventually disestablished sometime in the 3rd century, though the ultimate reason why is unknown. A fragment of the institution called the Daughter Library continued on until 391, when Emperor Theodosius banned it, considering it a pagan institution. The destruction of this institution marked the end of the last institutional vestige of the Great Library of Alexandria. Also, before I close this segment out, I do have to mention that Hypatia of Alexandria wasn't associated with the library, and it no longer existed while she was active. The story about how her real life became linked to the legend of the fall of the library is fascinating, and I'll be covering that in a future video, so make sure to subscribe for more content. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just jumping in the middle to ask for a small favor. If you're enjoying this video, click the share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members. Sharing my work with people who love historical content keeps my channel growing and allows me to keep cooking up new content. If you were asked to name the most outrageously free spirit in ancient history, you'd probably choose Diogenes of Sinope. As the quintessential cynic, he was the ancient world's greatest anti-conventionalist, a philosopher who didn't just advocate for a simple life, he lived it. And keep in mind that the word cynic is derived from a Greek word meaning dog-like, because trust me, this is going to come up in this segment. He famously slept in a public earthenware barrel and deliberately shocked the sensibilities of Athenian society with his activities. To give one of the better-known examples, and I've got to be a bit careful about how I say this, he was known to summon the Cyclops in the Agora, if you get my drift. Yeah, you heard me. Diogenes polished the spear of Achilles in the public square, in plain sight of everyone. And just to be clear, in case you were wondering, this was most certainly not the style at the time. His life was a philosophical performance dedicated entirely to radical self-sufficiency, known in Greek as autarkeia. He famously told Alexander the Great, who offered him anything he desired, to simply move out of his sunlight. This man, who dedicated his existence to challenging pretense and exposing falsehoods, demanded control over every facet of his being. Given his dedication to dramatic, purposeful living, it follows that his final moments couldn't possibly have been ordinary. To understand the legend surrounding Diogenes' death, we first have to appreciate his radical commitment to life in line with nature. Born in Sinope in Asia Minor, he was forced into exile, likely arriving in Athens already committed to rigorous ascetic training. He likely died around 320 BC, reaching the advanced age of nearly 90, probably while living in Corinth at a gymnasium called the Craneum. Diogenes' philosophical mission was derived from his bizarre interpretation of the Delphic oracle's equally cryptic and bizarre statement that he should deface coinage. He took this mandate as his lifelong task, to destroy the accepted norms and conventions that govern society and to call humanity back to an inherently natural state. He didn't bother writing comprehensive philosophical systems. Instead, he conveyed cynicism through personal, often provocative actions, positioning himself as a vigilant watchdog of morality who broke all the rules. For Diogenes, a life guided by reason was a life guided by nature, meaning true happiness and independence were only possible outside the bounds of the structured community. This required complete disregard for luxury and social customs. He maintained that autarkia was the ultimate goal, allowing a person to oppose courage to fortune and nature to convention. Diogenes structured his entire existence around the philosophical principle of self-mastery. Because of this, his biographers felt a strong ideological requirement to ensure his death reflected this absolute control. Whether this control was viewed as a positive or a negative would determine what sort of end-of-life treatment Diogenes got in a specific biography. A quiet, passive demise would have unintentionally undermined his lifelong philosophical assertion that he was the absolute captain of his own destiny. The multiple versions of Diogenes' death derive mainly from biographies which were compiled in a single text centuries after his death. Modern scholars caution that these ancient biographies are notoriously unreliable, often incorporating anecdotal material to enhance the value of the story. This was doubly true for death, and biographers of the time didn't simply record facts. They viewed the death scene as the final literary chance to confirm and glorify a character, a practice known as exitus illustrium uirorum. This essentially provided stylized deaths that were quote-unquote in character for a historical figure, rather than just saying, "Oh, he fell and broke his hip and died 2 days later." One of the most powerful and philosophically resonant accounts claims Diogenes chose the precise moment of his departure, dying by willfully holding his breath until he suffocated. This narrative, recorded by Cercidas of Megalopolis, presents the Cynic ideal in its most dramatic form. To master the most fundamental biological function, the impulse to breathe, is to achieve absolute freedom from the physical body and from nature itself. This act confirms the triumph of Diogenes' rational will over physical necessity, positioning his death as a final exercise in self-sufficiency. Modern science has proven this to be impossible, at least strictly speaking. While you can hold your breath until you pass out, once you've passed out, your body will begin to breathe again automatically, as if you're sleeping. That said, I suppose it's always possible that he held his breath and then fell and smashed his head in. Another vivid, if strange, version suggests Diogenes was taken by illness, specifically severe colic, after consuming a raw octopus. This tale serves as a dramatic commentary on the limits of his devotion to flouting social norms. By choosing to eat raw, unprepared food, Diogenes rejected one of humanity's most fundamental civilized conventions, the preparation of meals. His death, in this context, becomes an almost cautionary illustration that nature itself is indifferent, unforgiving, and that there's a reason for conventions. This biographical ending would have been understood by ancients to be a refutation of Diogenes as a person. A third account suggests that Diogenes died not from the seafood itself, but from a severe bite sustained in a struggle with stray dogs, potentially over the raw octopus. This narrative is rich in dark irony, creating a striking symmetry for ancient audiences. The man who willingly took the insult of being called kynikos, meaning dog-like in Greek, and lived among stray animals, is killed by his own symbolic kin. This unexpected reversal provided biographers with a shocking, memorable conclusion to his story. Diogenes was dog-like and was killed by dogs while doing a dog-like activity. For a biographer who wanted to write a memorable ending to Diogenes' life, it was low-hanging fruit. Despite the enduring appeal of these dramatic scenarios, contemporary scholarly opinion overwhelmingly holds that these tales are all fiction. Based on the available evidence, which notes his remarkably advanced age, the most plausible historical conclusion is that Diogenes died naturally. In ancient Greece, hitting 70 was considered a respectable but attainable age, while hitting 80 was quite uncommon but nothing to write home about. Hitting 90, though, was incredibly rare, and if you made it that far, you were basically on borrowed time. In the end, we're never going to know with certainty how Diogenes died, but it's pretty remarkable that he made it to 90 given his unconventional lifestyle. In the early 2nd century AD, the city of Rome was a sprawling metropolis, and likely the largest city in the world at the time. Historians estimate over 1 million people lived in Rome by the 2nd century. Of these, a significant fraction were enslaved people, perhaps on the order of 1/3 of the population. The remainder were free residents, which in Rome during this time mostly meant Roman citizens. Thus, hundreds of thousands of citizens called Rome home in 100 AD. The question is, how many of those citizens were actually working for a living? To modern eyes, we might assume most able-bodied urban dwellers would be employed. However, ancient Rome's economy and society were very different from ours. A large class of the population, the enslaved laborers previously mentioned, performed the bulk of manual work, and even many skilled jobs. Meanwhile, many free citizens survived without steady jobs, supported by slave labor, public welfare, and the vast wealth of the empire. The result was that a surprisingly large percentage of Roman citizens did not work in the sense of holding a regular occupation. Contemporary writers and modern historians alike have noted that Rome became a city of parasitic consumers living off the spoils of empire. To analyze this, we need to look at who among Rome's citizens did work, what jobs were available, and how others managed to get by without work. One major reason for low employment among Roman citizens was the institution of slavery. Enslaved people in Rome held jobs across the board. They weren't only domestic servants or gladiators or laborers, they also served as teachers, scribes, physicians, artisans, and more. Further, virtually any menial labor or basic service could be done by a slave. Wealthy households had slaves for cooking, cleaning, and tutoring children. Even many professions that would be well paid today, like teachers and doctors, were often occupied by highly educated Greek slaves in Roman times. This meant fewer openings for free citizens to find work. In addition, a large segment of working Romans were freedmen, former slaves who had been freed by their masters and who became citizens upon gaining freedom. Freedmen often remained in the city and put their skills to use in trades and businesses. In fact, evidence from tomb inscriptions indicates that the working economy of Rome was dominated by people of servile origin. Over 60% of inscriptions that mention an occupation in the city were commissioned by freedmen or even slaves, proudly recording their trades and achievements. These freedmen worked as bakers, carpenters, fishmongers, shopkeepers, leather workers. Basically, they formed the backbone of Rome's artisan and retail class. Further, even though they were now technically free, they still had obligations towards their former owners, who were then called their patrons. A poor freeborn citizen would find himself competing with skilled ex-slaves for jobs in every craft and service sector. For the lowest class free citizens, opportunities to earn a wage were limited. Some picked up work as casual laborers. For example, hauling goods at the docks or construction sites when large building projects were underway. Many lingered each day in hopes of being hired for short-term tasks. These day laborers lived a very precarious existence. Ancient sources and modern analyses describe a large class of underemployed poor in Rome, people with no steady income who survived on odd jobs and state charity. Even those who had a trade often earned very little as they had to compete against highly skilled laborers who were doing it for free. If so many Roman citizens had trouble finding gainful work, how did they survive? The Roman answer was the famous policy of bread and circuses. The emperors provided a grain dole, a form of public welfare, to feed the city's population, coupled with plentiful entertainment to keep people happy. By around 100 AD, about 200,000 adult male citizens in Rome were receiving free grain every month. This state-sponsored grain distribution essentially fed the poor of the capital. To put that number in perspective, 200,000 men would represent roughly 20% of Rome's total inhabitants in this period. Given that those 200,000 were generally heads of households, the grain dole supported a much larger portion of the citizen population, including their wives and children. Notably, the vast majority of citizen families needed the dole to survive. The bread was accompanied by the circuses, so to speak, and the entertainment was plentiful and free. The emperors and magistrates put on hundreds of holidays and festivals throughout the year, staging gladiator games, chariot races, theatrical shows, and more. During Emperor Claudius's reign from 41 to 54 AD, there were well over 150 days per year, classified as official holidays, when no public business was conducted. Rome's leaders were quite aware that keeping the urban populace fed and entertained was a key to maintaining order. Modern scholars interpret this as the Roman state essentially buying urban peace by subsidizing the citizens' livelihood. The grain dole and extravagant games pacified the unemployed masses, a sort of social contract where the people gave up political power in exchange for being taken care of. It was, arguably, history's first big welfare program, and it recognized that hundreds of thousands of Romans had no prospect of meaningful employment. By providing the essentials, the empire made it viable for so many citizens to remain idle, and to prevent discontent, they provided entertainment. It's important to note that even for those citizens who did have jobs, the workday was relatively short, and the tempo of work was relaxed by modern comparison. Most Romans who worked had a 6-hour workday, roughly from dawn until noon. After midday, business generally closed, and people spent the afternoons at leisure, attending baths, watching games, or resting. There was no concept of a busy 9-to-5 grind, and the culture of Rome valued leisure time. Of course, it's necessary to remember that this laid-back lifestyle was supported heavily by enslaved people performing most vital tasks in society. These slaves had horrible lives, and were often worked to death in the mines or on giant farming estates. Essentially, free Roman citizens could afford to work less because enslaved workers and provincial resources propped up their urban comforts. Taking all this into account, what percentage of Rome's citizens were actually working around 100 AD? While exact figures are impossible as the Romans didn't keep labor statistics, historians have made educated estimates. Modern economic studies describe mass unemployment and underemployment in Imperial Rome as a unique phenomenon. Scholars estimate that only between 20 and 30% of adult Roman male citizens worked in what we would describe as a regular employment capacity. Including those who worked irregularly or at their leisure, this number may have been as high as 40%. Notably, even lower-class women with Roman citizenship didn't work unless it was to assist in a small family business. To put it simply, a huge percentage of Roman citizens in Rome didn't work for a living. As economic historians have noted, it wouldn't be until the 20th century that such large, totally unproductive adult male populations would be seen again.